Hello and welcome to this workshop on contextualizing and using secondary sources. My name is Dr. Cara Berger. I work at Bruford College in Theatre Studies as a tutor. So what I'm going to ask you to do in this workshop is both listen to some of the things that I'll talk you through, but also undertake some exercises. And I will at times be asking you to just stop the video and take a moment to think through something or to look at something on the slide and take some notes. And at other times, I'm going to ask you to stop the video and to type in a URL that will take you to a Google Doc where there are further instructions for you, and where I'm going to ask you to undertake a little bit of thinking and working with a particular bit of writing, because what we're doing today is really specific to different types of secondary sources, different ways of creating arguments. I think it's really important to not talk just abstractly, but to really get into some of the details of how in real life academics are constructing arguments, how they're using sources, and how you might use these models and what you're learning in your own writing, because really what this workshop as a whole is aimed at is supporting you in your writing and your understanding of how to contextualize and how to use secondary sources in the most productive way possible. So before we get stuck in to the bits that are really meaty and that I'm going to ask you to undertake some exercises, I wanted to start with a preamble. So I've called this workshop Always Contextualize, and in doing that, I'm making a nod to a very famous proclamation by the critic Frederic Jameson, which was to always historicize. Now, I've changed the wording a little bit to take us away from only history and to open up the possibility of lots of other different contexts and different types of contexts we might be engaging with, but also to sort of stay within the vocabulary that theatre studies students in particular might already be aware of. So we talk a lot about contextualising in various bits of the theatre studies course. So I wanted to make that fit a little bit better. In the name of always contextualizing, you might notice, if you're proficient with your Harvard referencing, that I've done something slightly unusual in how I have represented the reference to Jameson's proclamation here. And that is that there are two dates here. So there's 2014, and then in brackets and square brackets behind that, I've put 1981. You may be wondering why I did that. So the year 2014 is the edition of the specific book, the reprint, that I consulted when rereading Jameson's ideas for today. And 1981 is the year in which originally this book was published. Now, you don't necessarily have to do this all the time when you're referencing, but I did this because we are doing a workshop on contextualizing. And I think the context of 1981, and as we can see also already from the reference, New York University Press, called Cornell University Press, is important in thinking about where Jameson's own ideas sit, that it is the 80s, that it is the later Cold War period, that this is thinking that is happening in America. These things, I think, have an impact on Jameson's outlook and on his call to always historicize, as are the intellectual lineages that Frederic Jameson himself places himself within. So he's an outspokenly Marxist critic, so he's building on ideas of historical materialism, which is a specific way of analysing history and trying to understand context. You can see from the name of the book that I've taken this from, The Political Unconscious, that he's drawing on this word, the unconscious. So there's a relationship here to psychoanalysis, for example, and some of Freud's ideas. So already in this little sentence, or these two words, and this quote here, the citation, you can see there's lots of context within that, and there's lots of context that we can already start pulling out that is interesting for us and that provides context for Jameson's call that we should always think about context. Now, in this book and in its introduction, where he proclaims always historicize, there's one idea I think that is quite useful for us to pick out and to think a little bit further about. But we're not going to be, spending too much time with Jameson himself. So he distinguishes when we are contextualizing or historicizing between what he calls the path of the object and the path of the subject. And I think this is useful for us to think about. So the path of the object for Jameson is how the object, and by this he means a book or a concept or an idea or a theory, is influenced by its context at the time of its creation. So ideas don't come out of nowhere. They are deeply embedded in a particular time, geography, lineage of thought, the author's own training, and so on. So when we look at the path of the object, we're looking at how it has been influenced by all this rich stuff that is happening around it. It isn't something that happens in isolation. Now, the path of the subject for Jameson is how the object has been reinterpreted by others in other contexts. So how ideas have been translated into other books, have been translated into other concepts, other ideas, other theories. And indeed, as you enter scholarly dialogue as a student, you are starting to do this. So you are participating in this path of the subject by using theories from one place and maybe putting them in a slightly different place, by applying them to an example that maybe they haven't been applied to before, and so on. So as scholars, we are the path of the subject. We are invested in doing that, and that's the work that we do in a scholarly fashion. So what I'm going to suggest then is that we need to look at how we have to have an awareness of the path of the object, so the context that has influenced a particular piece of secondary resource, of secondary literature, in order to be able to accomplish this kind of reinterpretation into new contexts that we might be doing in our own writing when creating our own, sometimes original, but hopefully exciting and at least slightly creative arguments that we're trying to make when we are writing in a scholarly fashion, when we're writing essays or other kinds of scholarly pieces of writing. So to summarize then, we are looking at context in two ways in this particular workshop. So firstly, we're looking at how to contextualize the sources that you use in order to be able to use them critically and in an informed manner. So we're not just accepting things without further thought. We're thinking about how they sit within a particular context themselves, how they are arising out of a particular context. And then we're going to have a look at how to use sources to contextualize our own argument, and that is engaging and reinterpreting at times ideas, theories, terminology for a different and new context, which might simply be our own argument. So in more concrete terms, what we're going to be looking at in this workshop is at selecting sources. So how do you choose out of the plethora of sources that are out there? We will be looking at examining sources in context, how we analyze and evaluate arguments, and how to embed research in our own writing. And we'll be doing little bits of each of those. Two things we won't be looking at for today. So we won't be looking at where to find sources specifically. So I'd ask you to look at Frank True's library workshops if that is something that you're looking for. So what are the mechanics of finding things? And then how to reference sources. And I'd ask you to refer to your own program guidance for that. So we won't be looking at Harvard method or things like that. The practice is a citation. So we're looking more at the critical academic ways of working with these things rather than the technical skills around them. So let's dive straight in to our first topic, which is how to select sources. And this is the first moment where I'm going to ask you to take a short break, to stop the video, and to just spend a moment reflecting on how you've selected sources until now in your degree pathway. So you've got a load of sources that you've identified in front of you on a list on your computer. Which ones do you choose to read, seeing that you don't have endless capacity? So I'd ask you to stop the video now and spend a moment reflecting on this. Okay, hopefully you've had a chance to do this. So what I'd like you now to do is to consider the different types of sources and some of the major different types of sources that you might encounter as part of your theatre studies degree, and to think particularly about what are pros and what are cons of these different types of sources. And I'm going to list a few of them, and then I'm going to ask you to stop the video again, and then I'll talk you through some of my approaches to these things. So one type of source you might encounter is the peer-reviewed academic journal article. And I want to just stop there for a moment and explain a few things around that. So you may or may not have come across the term peer-reviewed before. If you haven't, peer review means that when, for example, I write academic work and I want to get it published in a journal, and in an academic journal specifically, my work is given to a range of readers. Numbers vary on the different journals, who will then read my work in depth and give me feedback and say either this work is of a standard that can now go ahead to be published, or there's still some work needed, or absolutely don't, this is not good enough for this journal, this shouldn't be published. So it's a kind of way of ensuring quality that is done through the academic community. And that is one of the real strengths, as I will already give away, of academic journal articles, is this very, very clear process for developing quality within them. Then you might encounter books that are published by academic presses. So those might be things like the Oxford University Press, various other types of university presses, publishers like Routledge or Bloomsbury, and there are others as well. You might come across newspaper articles and reviews or blogs by theatre critics. You might come across non-academic books, so books that are not published necessarily by academic presses, or that are published by academic presses but are not written by academics. So you might think about, for example, an expert practitioner who, after 30 years of practice, has now sat down to write a book about their practice and about the history of their work. And you might think about, how is that different from an academic from a specifically academic book? And you might think about homepages of theatre companies, theatre institutions, practitioners. So those are some of the major things that you might encounter. So I'd ask you to take a moment to stop the video and to think about the pros and cons of each of these. Okay, and we're coming back together again. One thing that I wanted to do around journals as well is actually just show you one. So we're going to talk through peer-reviewed academic articles in a moment. So this I've just grabbed from next to my desk. This is a journal. You very seldomly, I think, as a student these days, really engage with the physical object of a journal. So these are regularly published. Different journals publish at different intervals, usually at least twice a year, up to 6, 7, 8 times a year. They contain a series of different articles, all peer-reviewed and looked over by the editors. Sometimes they're themed, sometimes they're not. Themed ones can be very useful if you're looking for a particular thematic area and there's a themed journal, you probably want to read all around that. And I thought it was just useful to think about, these are actually still physical objects, even if we seem to often only engage with them as electronic objects these days, but they do often still exist as a physical form, and this is where they come from, and this is what they look like. So thinking through the different types of sources we have, so I've just given a few starting points for thinking this through. I'm not going to say this is extensive and this is all the pros and all the cons, just this is some of the headlines. And I think it would be worth thinking about what you might want to add to this and where there might be difficulties as well. These things are not straightforward. They're not sometimes as simple as a neat table might make them look. So the pros of an academic journal article is the reliability and the academic rigor, as I mentioned, this process of peer review that really pushes authors and pushes the quality of the academic work. They tend to be reasonably up to date. It can take quite a long time to get a journal article published, but it's usually less than a book. And they tend to be very original arguments. So journal articles tend to have really streamlined, in-depth, detailed arguments about one thing and tend to really try to push at knowledge. That's what the journal article does. The cons can be access. So you can access some journals via the library, but some might be less accessible to you. You can often pay for journal articles, but they're really quite expensive for an individual to buy compared to how long they are. Also, one of the things that is a pro can also be a con. So this originality of argument, this really in-depth argument, means that it can also be quite niche. It can be quite tricky to try and generalize from that, or to develop it into your own argument if someone is doing something that is really, really specific and really quite in depth. So that is something that you need to think about when reading journal articles as well, is that it's often very, very delineated what it's dealing with. So books from academic presses, you have similarly an academic rigor, you have in-depth reading of that material, and they're usually either editors if it's a series of chapters by different people, or there's editors for the overall book if it's all written by one person. What you have in books more than in journal articles is a breadth of coverage. So you might not have work that goes quite so much in detail in every single bit, but tries to speak a bit wider. So some of the problems there might be addressed in that way. Some of the cons are the cost if you're buying them. Some academic press books can be very, very expensive. And the time investment that you might need to have in order to read a whole book, because a book obviously is quite a lot longer than a journal article. Moving on to reviews and newspaper editorials. So the pros involve that you have an expert viewer, so someone who has a lot of experience viewing theatres, probably at the theatre all the time. So there's this expertise of knowing a scene, knowing what is current going on there. And you have access to a primary experience, so to someone's own experience of seeing work very immediately, and also much more up to date than any academic material could be, because it takes years to publish any kind of academic piece of writing, whereas newspaper reviews come out within days of something going on. And I've put here very clearly that you have one primary experience. So where we can very interestingly use newspaper reviewers' experiences, maybe how they are also describing the rest of the audience, in order to theorize what's happening in a particular performance, we need to always be clear that is only one person's experience. We can never speak for everyone from this one person's experience. Which leads to some of the problems with it. So one of the problems we might have is the subjectivity of a reviewer. So they write to a very tight deadline. They don't have a huge amount of time to reflect on the work. It's not the years and years of work that an academic might do. So there's a subjectivity and an immediacy there that might be tricky for us, or that we might want to at least contextualize and be careful with when we're working with this kind of material. A newspaper or a critic for a newspaper might also not undertake further research, whereas an academic would. An academic might look at the same theatre makers' other pieces. They might look at their training, they might look at their history, they might want to start doing all of that contextualizing, which a newspaper reviewer normally won't do. So I've added here that there's no or little contextualization within the context of newspaper reviews, which we need to be aware of. Then looking at non-academic press books, or books that might be published by an academic press but not by someone who is undertaking an academic methodology. Some of the pros include that someone might be speaking as a contemporary witness. So you might be having access to a load of encounters and ideas, and ways of thinking about work from someone who was there and who was living it. And there's a really particular kind of knowledge that comes from that can be very, very useful for you. And we also have the expertise through practice. So if we're, for example, reading some work by an expert practitioner, there's a kind of particular form of knowledge that comes from that, that we can use to contextualize maybe our own practical work or the work that we're writing about. Some of the cons might include that they are taking a very particular viewpoint. So they may be interested in their own work or the work that they know, and are not interested in looking at what is out with it, or indeed what might be excluded from it. So that kind of critique that an academic might undertake might not happen in this kind of work. It can happen as well, but depending on the author, it just might be a variable in that. So we need to think about the viewpoint which this work is written from. And the contextualization might be variable. So some authors might want to draw in context if that's relevant to their practice. Others might be less interested in doing that. And that's where we then, as academics, as scholars, as people writing scholarly, need to supplement that contextualization. That's where we need to do it ourselves in order to place things carefully and not just accept things unmediated from other writers. And finally, websites by practitioners or theatres. Some of the pros might involve that we have might involve access to intentions and self-image. So how practitioners talk about their own work might give us a sense of what their aspirations are, of what their intentions are, what the image is that they are trying to cultivate around their practice, what their values might be, what their ethics might be. We can also assume that there's going to be accuracy in terms of data that is provided to us. So for example, when a piece was on, who was involved in it, when we're looking at a theatre's homepage, how many seats there are, what the history of the building is. So those kind of things we can take as accurate usually. Some of the cons of this kind of material might be that it's hard to work out where something is marketing and where it isn't. So websites and personal websites might not be so interested in giving a critical assessment of the work. They might not be interested in giving counter arguments or looking carefully at whether the aspirations and ethos and so on is actually bears out in reality. So that's where our own analysis needs to come into it, and where we need to ask questions of, well, if this company is claiming this about themselves, where do we see it? Is there evidence for that actually happening, or is there evidence also where that is not happening, and where we might point out that there may be problems with the work that is being done? So we won't maybe encounter counter arguments for what practitioners or what buildings are claiming about themselves, because that's not in their interest, and that's not what a homepage necessarily is there for. So I wanted to finish this section with just a few tips on selecting sources. So if you've got a lot of different pieces of work and you are asking, where do I start? Here are a few tips with that. So I would recommend always starting by reading the abstract or blurb. So abstract in a journal article, blurb in a book, to get a sense of, does this sound like it's sitting in the right area for me? So just getting a beginning sense of, is this useful? And we'll be looking at abstracts and how to start thinking about the context that are happening within that within the next exercise. If a book sounds like it might be useful, but you're still having questions over, should I read all of this or should I just read bits of it? Looking at the introduction and conclusion can be useful. Nearly every introduction to an academic book these days will have, in some part of it, a rundown on what each chapter covers. And there you can get a really good sense of what chapters are relevant to me, which ones are less relevant to me, where should I prioritize my reading. If you're still sort of wondering more generally whether something is useful, the conclusion can sometimes give you a sense of where things have gone, what bits have been important, and that might be another way of trying to access that. And then if you have doubts, I'd say always choose peer-reviewed materials, so journal articles, academic press books, over non-peer-reviewed materials. Okay, moving on to our next topic, which is sources in context. So on the right-hand column there, you will see that I have given you some potential contexts. I'm not saying these are all the contexts that you might encounter in your life, nor that they're completely separate, but these are some quite useful prompts for thinking about the different kinds of contexts that a source might be sitting within, and also that it might be intervening into. So we need to start from an understanding that all critical academic writing emerges from a context and is in some way impacted by the context that it's coming from, but also seeks to intervene into a particular context. And that's part of what academic writing is doing. It's intervening into a history of ideas. It's trying to suggest something slightly different. It's trying to reroute things in a different direction. Good academic writing always follows originality. So it's not about repeating stuff that's already there, but it wants to create new knowledge. And that's what professional academics do. Their work is to create new knowledge. So there's an intervention and a kind of a quite conscious intervention that is part of the work that academics do. So why would we want to contextualize our sources? What does that allow us to do as students specifically? It will allow you to understand the different factors that have shaped an author's perspective and how it might impact on their argument. So this might lead you to think about what kind of sources you might select or not select when writing about a particular area. So if you are, say, reading a source from the 1950s talking about the 1890s, you might think about, okay, well, why was theatre scholarship at in the 1950s? It's not contemporaneous to the 1890s, so that sort of special insight of someone writing at the time isn't there. Maybe actually I should be looking for something more contemporary, or if not, you might at least be able to give some critical context to the source in order to say, well, this is why I'm looking at this particular source, even if it is, say, 70 years old. This is the context that it's happening in. This is a very important moment in time for the scholarship of this area. It might allow you to gain a fuller understanding of how the author is positioning their argument in relation to existing ideas and contexts, and then why this argument is important. So if you start thinking about academic writing and secondary sources as a constant conversation with each other, where people are building on or diverting from or trying to refute each other's ideas, you can start getting a sense of where in that conversation a particular individual item might be and what its role might be. So is it going against loads of things that happened before it? Is it a moment in time where a whole new set of ideas start off from this? And then where do you sit in relationship to it as well? So you can then start doing the work of placing your own work in relationship to this conversation once you know who the players of the conversation are and how they relate to each other. And this will allow you to compare and contrast the sources context to, firstly, the context of your case study or the chosen context that you're writing about. So thinking again about if you've got a source from the 1950s writing about the 1890s, how do those two contexts sit with each other? And then your own scholarly context, which is now, which is 2020. So how has the conversation changed and developed since the source that you are actually looking at? So the 1950s source in my fictional example just now. So in all of this, what this allows you to do is to work critically and in an informed way with the sources that you're working with, to be able to show your awareness of where they're sitting, what they're doing, what is specific about them, and how they relate to both where you're at in the academic conversation and where your case studies sit and the particular pieces that you might be writing about, or the practice that you're undertaking yourself, of course, as well. So this is the first moment where I'm going to ask you to pause the video again and to undertake a little exercise that I've prepared for you. So I've copied into the URL that is at the bottom here, the abstract to a really great journal article called Decolonizing Immersion by Riona Mitra. And what I'm going to ask you to do, and you'll see instructions when you get there as well, is to read the short piece of writing and to have a look where you can find different contexts. So maybe taking our list here, where can you see all of these different contexts popping up? And maybe you want to also differentiate between where you can see Mitra's context impacting on her and where you can see her trying to influence the preceding context. So you'll be taken to a page, a Google Doc, where first you have the abstract. And then on the second page, I've given you 2-3 examples of where I see particular context. So if you're a little bit stuck, you can have a look at how I did it and then go back and have a look at adding more of this. So I've really just done a couple things. I could have done this for hours. So have a look where you can find further context yourself. So please do stop the video now, type in the URL and spend a little bit of time with this exercise. Okay, moving on to our third topic for today, which is using sources in your argument and how to critique arguments. So when you're looking at a source, To a certain extent, you want to be asking whether you buy their argument and whether that argument works for you. And Jane has a video that has a more in-depth materials on how to build your own arguments. What we're looking at here really is more how to critique arguments. And I'm going to give you a sort of whirlwind tour or whistle-stop tour of argumentation here, just so you can start thinking about how are people constructing arguments, how can you critically access that. And I'd recommend maybe to find a piece of work that you're reading at the moment, an academic article of some sort, and think about, how is this author making that argument? And, you know, where are they making arguments which are really strong? Where are they making arguments that may be weaker? Because as much as we get better at making arguments, it's still really hard. Sometimes even professional academics, even the best writers, can be a little bit lazy in certain moments, or they might be condensing certain things in order to be able to move on as well with their own thinking. So let's start by just asking, what is an argument? An argument is a set of evidenced claims or ideas involving a consideration of these claims or ideas in relation to each other in order to come to a conclusion. So an argument is something usually that reaches across a longer piece of writing, has a set of claims, different steps in the argument if you want, that relate to each other and that drive towards some form of a conclusion. Now we can dig deeper into this and break it down a little bit more to understand more fundamentally how arguments work. So if an argument is composed of claims, a claim itself can be broken down further. So a claim is a statement of truth or what should be believed and are always arguable. So we aren't dealing with just definitive facts. It's something that we're trying to persuade our reader towards. So we're making a claim about reality, often and particularly in arts and in theatre studies, that that has a claim to truth, but that can be argued about. That is not just a definitive fact. That isn't just this happened on this day and we all know this for absolute sure. So a claim is supported by a set of reasons. So that might be the different reasons that you give in order to try and convince us of your overall claim. And this can include dealing with counterclaims, and we'll look at that in a moment. So you might be, so you don't always only argue positively for what you're claiming. You might also look at what might be potential critiques of what you're claiming and try and already get ahead of that and already say, this is why I think this particular understanding of it would be wrong, and here are my reasons for that. And reasons are always built on evidence of some form, and that can be really quite varied types of evidence, particularly when we're talking about theatre and the study of theatre. So types of evidence can include things like facts, statistics, raw data that you've analysed, whether that is material that you've found in an archive, whether these are audience questionnaires that you've collected, whether you have done some sort of quantitative review of particular words used in newspaper articles. So there can be a sort of big data approach to creating evidence and then supporting reasons. This is probably not the type of material that we deal with the most when we're doing things like theatre studies, opera studies, and so on. So in an arts context, we do use that kind of material, but less often than the other types that I will talk about. Most of the time, in fact, our evidence will come from analysis. So our own original analysis of a particular case study, which could be a particular performance, it could be a particular text, it could be a particular theatre building. And we are analysing it in order to support our reasons that then our claims are founded upon. And the accuracy and nuance and detail of our analysis is really where it stands and falls, and how persuasive we are in our analysis for the reader. You might also, as evidence, draw on existing published research. So things that are not your own analysis, that are not your own ideas, but that is material out there that you can carefully draw on and that you are convinced by, because you have analysed it yourself, you've checked some of it, you have looked at whether you are convinced by its own claims in order to further your argument. So in some steps you might say, well, I can't, reinvent everything right now. So I'll be using this material that is already out there, that is already evidenced, and I'll build on that in one step of my argument, because someone else has done the work. I don't need to do the work another time. But I'm doing this in order to build my own original argument. So hopefully this has given you a little bit of a sense of how you might look at claims, reasons, and evidence in terms of how arguments are built. And I'd really recommend that you think a little bit about how does this work when you're engaging both with your own writing, but also looking at other people's writing, because a lot of the time we get better at writing by reading lots of other people's writing. So by looking at how other people have done it, what they do well, what you find less convincing, will make you a better writer and will make you someone who can argue in a firmer, more persuasive way. To help you further with this, I wanted to briefly look at weak strong arguments. And this is not comprehensive, and you'll find a lot of material out there that goes into much more detail. But these are some starting points that I think might be useful when thinking about types of arguments and whether they're convincing or not. So let's start with some examples of weak arguments. Common sense. So this is just common sense. I don't need to engage further with this. Terrible type of argument, particularly in an academic context. As scholars, as academics, we always want to ask what is underneath common sense. Common sense is already so conditioned by context that we really need to get underneath it and ask questions about it. So any appeals to common sense, I would really ask you to go deeper into that and ask what lies beneath that. What are the hidden claims? What are the hidden reasons that underlie it? And is it actually convincing? Argument by repetition. This is something that I see quite often in student essays, is as long as I say it over and over again, I hope it's going to become true. So again, that's where you might be missing claims, where you might be missing reasoning, where you might be missing evidence. So just saying something over and over again doesn't make a strong argument. It's when we get the evidence and see how someone is dealing with the evidence and what there is where we start getting convinced by arguments. Overgeneralizations can be a big problem. So not taking into account, for example, shifting context. Because something is true in one place doesn't mean that is true in exactly the same way in another place, in another time, in another culture, in another geographical place. So we need to really be clear about where generalizations are possible and where they're not possible. And that's why context is so important. And where there can also be a lot of really interesting stuff happening in those changes when things move into different contexts. In fact, that's where a lot of originality lies, where a lot of new work can happen, is in the shifting and changes of ideas as they go from one place to another. So we always need to ask, can we actually generalize this? Is this possible? And if not, what are the new ideas that might come out of that? The sentence, it could be argued that, without delivering the argument without it, or following up with the actual argument. That's similar to the argument by repetition. If you use this a lot in your own writing, it's not a terrible thing as a sentence itself, but but ask yourself whether you do actually follow this up with actual arguments, with evidence, with reasons, and with claims. A type of argument that you might see quite often is an appeal to authority. So this very clever person out there who's very famous has said it, so it must be true. Again, as academics, we want a deep digger. It may well be true, but without evidence, there's no way of really knowing that. So again, we want to see much more conscious argumentation and weighing of evidence. And this is why your contextualization of the sources that you work with is so important. So I want students to be able to also ask critical questions of, say, famous voices in the field, to deal with the evidence. It may well be true that they're right, but just because they're well known doesn't make them right in themselves. So dealing with, where's the evidence? What's the argument? Are the reasons there? Is the evidence actually supporting the reasons? that's the kind of work we want you to be doing when you're dealing with secondary sources. What then makes strong arguments? The expression of an argument itself, so really knowing what an argument, what you actually are arguing, or that the author knows what they are arguing, that is a large part of it already, because then we can start testing our evidence against the argument that is stated. Providing the reasoning, so breaking down the argument into a set of different reasons that hold it up. Providing evidence for those reasons and the analysis of that evidence. And we've talked about different types of evidence that you might be dealing with. So does the evidence actually support the reasons? Does the author give the analysis of the evidence that allows us to support the reasons or not? Often counterclaims being discussed and refuted can be a sign of a good argument. So you've thought through, or the author's thought through, what could be the counterclaims? What could someone try and argue in order to refute what they are saying? So you get ahead of the game and already start going, well, you could argue this and against the point that I'm making, but here's my evidence against that counterclaim. And that's some really, really good work when you start doing that. Which brings me to thinking about ways of disagreeing and ways of disagreeing with existing arguments. And you are invited as a student to disagree with the stuff that you're reading. You don't have to agree with everything. But as always, the quality of your argument, and in this case, your counter argument, is hugely, hugely important. So here you see a pyramid of different types of arguments, some which are good and some which are very, very bad. So at the bottom of the pyramid, we have things like name calling, attacks on the character of the writer rather than actually engaging with the argument that the writer might have put forward, looking at tone rather than what the content of the argument again. Then in the middle point, we've got the contradiction, so just stating the case against without actually engaging with the evidence that the writer might have brought to bear. So that's sort of in the middle, but it's still not great. So everything below contradiction is really bad argumentation, has no place in your own writing. Everything above this starts becoming useful, and we're probably not always doing, the absolute pinnacle of arguing. That's not always what has to happen, but the top part is where we really want to land if we are trying to disagree with a source or with a writer's point of view. So we find things like the counter argument, so the contradicting and then backing that up with our own reasoning and supporting evidence. So delivering evidence that contradicts the point that is being made is a really basic way of, or the sort of, meaty way of starting to disagree with a source. Refutation, which finds a mistake and explain why it is mistaken, using quotes and using evidence. So that's not just stating the counter case, but it's finding the mistake in the argument. And then within the sort of larger area of refutation, we can talk about refuting the central point. So not just refuting a part of the argument, but like the core part of the argument, the central point from which everything else emanates, and under which everything collapses if you manage to refute that. So refutation is, as it says here, in a basic way, is a countering of an argument or point with evidence. So as you see here, evidence is hugely important. Actually engaging with an argument is hugely important. And that's the ways in which we start being able to disagree in ways that are useful and productive, and also respectful of the argument that someone else has put forward. Okay, and now we land on the final part of our workshop for today, which is integrating sources into your writing. And here again, I've got a little exercise that will see you navigating away from the video. So I want to start with thinking through some of the way in which you might use sources to develop your own argument. And that's really what this is about. And this is what we always are looking for, is to hear your argument, but supported by and contextualized by secondary materials. So you might use secondary materials to provide context to your ideas and case studies. So if you are studying, say, a particular period or a particular example of performance, we're not expecting you to be able to research all of those different contexts in which it sits yourself. So say you're looking at naturalism, you might think about the technological context that was happening at the time and its impact on stagecraft. You might be thinking about the kind of philosophical changes that are happening at the time, Darwinian ideas, things like that. You might think about the social context. So part of doing your research is acquiring that and acquiring that knowledge. And you get that from reading secondary sources and from citing them in your writing, so that you can bring them to bear on that. You can't just know that all of that material by yourself, or even do that research. That would be impossible. So you are drawing on lots and lots of secondary sources in order to provide that context and to understand that context, that you can then start placing your performance case studies, or your the theatre that you're studying, the practitioner that you're studying, the play that you're studying within. You might use secondary sources to provide concepts or ideas that you maybe extend, build on, or adapt. So this is where you're sort of saying, you know, this is an idea that's super useful. However, it's written for this particular time and place. What happens if I extend that, or if I slightly change it and I build further on it to make it fit my new context? So that is where you're doing this, this work of the path of the subject that Jameson talks about and that we started off with today. So you're allowing a concept to have a new life in a slightly different context, and that might even just be a different play but from the same period, but things are never completely identical. So you are maybe developing a context or an idea, a concept or an idea, by bringing it into a slightly new context. You might use sources to provide ideas or concepts that you can test or critique. So if you're studying a particular area and there's a way of thinking that is really dominant, but you may want to take issue with that, you might want to critique it, you might want to contest some of its ideas. And that's where thinking around counter arguments and refutation becomes very important. So you might build your own outlook and your own way of thinking, your own argument, by pushing back against some of the things that are already out there. So you might do this by showing how a particular concept doesn't actually fit the context that you're writing in, and how you maybe need to come up with new concepts or new ways of looking at things because the dominant ideas maybe don't fit what you're looking at. You can use sources to provide counter arguments which you refute. So if you're looking for ways of strengthening your argument by thinking about potential counter arguments, you might think about, well, what are these dominant ideas out there? Which of them don't fit? Where can I use them to go, well, many people are going to think this, but I'm going to push against that. I'm going to refute this idea and strengthen my own argument while I'm doing that. They also provide evidence that you know about the field that you're speaking about. And this is something that professional academic writers absolutely do need to do, but it's even more important if you're a student, because you need to actually evidence to us, to the marker, that you have done the reading, that you know the key works, that you know the key authors that you should have read in the area. So sometimes it's sort of a bit more functional in its approach, in terms of just showing, yes, I have read this, I understand it, and I know that it's there, and I have acquired an understanding of this particular area of scholarship or this particular area of practice. So in the next little thing that I would invite you to do, again, I'm going to ask you to stop the video. I'm going to ask you to navigate to a Google Doc again, and this time I've got some excerpts from an academic article that will show you how a professional academic is working with lots and lots of different types of sources in their own work. So what I've done is I've highlighted whenever they mention in these very short excerpts, it's only a page and a little bit. So every time they mention another author, I've highlighted that for you so you can already see it. I'd like you to think about, with this list, where can you see them doing this? So whenever they're using a specific author, where would you categorize their use of that author in relation to these different points? And think about that really on a sentence-to-sentence basis. So they might be saying, you know, here I am showing you that I have read this, which is very important. Here I'm building the context for this concept and for this idea. But in the last moment, I'm actually going to signal that I'm countering this, that here is something that I think is a gap, or here is something that I think isn't strong enough about that argument, which they then use to do their rest of the argument, which we don't see here because we've only got these little excerpts. So think about, can you see how many of these different purposes or uses of sources can you see in the little excerpts that I've provided to you? Okay, so I'm going to ask you to stop the video now and spend a little bit of time with that. Okay, welcome back for the last few words of today. There's not a huge amount left, and hopefully there's been some stuff for you to work through and some things that you might want to go back over. You may have been wondering why I have this picture of an iceberg on this slide. It's really just to give you a sense of, and to get you thinking about how you work with sources in a larger scale. So if we think about the bottom of the iceberg as your research process and the top of the iceberg as, say, you're writing an essay, you might be writing something different, but let's say it's an essay. The top of the iceberg, the bit that we actually get to see, you might just see a really specifically curated, well-chosen set of sources that you've put together in order to do all the different bits of contextualization, to do all the things that we have on the right-hand side, and that gives you this wonderful tight essay with your own argument. Below that, there might be lots and lots and lots of reading, maybe not reading in huge detail, but looking at abstracts, looking at different books, scanning different websites and different articles and different book chapters, which you may not use directly in your essay. They may just not make their way into it. And sometimes students express frustration about doing actually quite a lot of reading and then not really finding a way to fit it into their essay. And in some ways it is frustrating, and I don't have a trick. In fact, I would really caution against trying to jump straight to the top of the iceberg. As you developing as an author, as a thinker, as a maker, as someone who is engaging with all the different forms that are theatre, opera, and so on in the world, there will be a lot of reading that underpins the bit that we see and where you develop as a thinker, but that might not make it into the essay. But this work is hugely important. So don't take it as lost work or lost hours. This is the work that you need in order to sharpen your own approach, in order to work out what you actually need in order to make your argument work the best, how to make your selection the best, how to find the best secondary sources in order to support what you're doing. So you can't skip this bit. You can't have the top of the iceberg without what lies beneath it. But you do need to do that work, and it's the work that really allows your work to shine in the end. Is you notice when that work is below the surface, and you notice when the tip of the iceberg is built on a fundament and there's something quite extensive beneath it. It's how your writing gets better. That said, of course, any time that you directly engage with any ideas, any data, any analysis that isn't your own, of course you have to cite it, and then you have to bring it into the top of the iceberg. But you might still do quite a lot of reading that doesn't quite make it into the bit that we see on the surface. Okay, so I hope this has been useful to you. I hope that you can work with the materials, and that this will provide you some ways of thinking about contextualizing and using sources in your future essays. Thank you for listening, and bye-bye.